Policy Analyst at HAW, and we organize this webinar on behalf of Clean Air Task Force and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Today's webinar will focus on the results of a study conducted by Ben Grove at Clean Air Task Force and George Peridas at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory on the economics of carbon capture and storage projects in California. Before we get going, I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded and will be available upon request. If you would like a copy of the recording, please reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat box for all of you. There are two ways to ask questions today: the Q&A box or the raised hand function. For typed questions, please use the Q&A function and not the chat box. We will also be waiting until the presentation is complete to start answering non-administrative questions. Before I hand it over to Ben and George to introduce themselves and kick off the presentation, I'm going to briefly hand it over to Sally Allen at the Livermore Lab Foundation, who is the sponsor of the study and would like to say a few words. Sally?
Thank you, Kaylin, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. The Livermore Lab Foundation is a key philanthropic partner to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. We are dedicated to advancing research initiatives and inspiring the next generation of scientists and engineers at the lab. We're really just honored to have an opportunity to support the research that's going to be discussed today. Climate resilience and energy resilience is a key pillar of our research portfolio. And so this latest report is just one of several that we've been pleased to support to contribute to the collective understanding and public discourse on these topics. So just really excited to hear from Ben and George today, and I will hand it over to them. Thanks so much.
I'll go ahead first to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Ben Grove. I work for Clean Air Task Force as a carbon storage manager on our carbon management team. I'm a geologist by training. I've been working in the CCS space for about a decade now, previously focusing on technical aspects of storage and project development. And now for the last 2 years at Clean Air Task Force, I've been more focused on policy advocacy and education. Just a quick note on CATF. We're a global nonprofit climate organization that really works to catalyze change in technologies and policies that are needed to reach net zero emissions and decarbonize our global economy. So I'll turn it over to George here to get things kicked off.
Thank you, Ben, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. We have a large and distinguished crowd today, and I'm very impressed that a title like CCS Economics can draw a crowd like this. If I'd known this earlier in my youth, I would have structured my party conversations differently. But thank you very much for making time this morning. We're delighted to share the results of a recent study that my partner Ben Grove and I undertook. Lawrence Livermore National Lab is one of several National Department of Energy sponsored labs here in the United States. We do many things. I work in the climate and carbon team, and our goal is to be of public service to governments, stakeholders, individuals, and to find ways in which we can meet our climate goals. It's a big challenge, and we try and contribute in ways in which we can be catalytic. If we can move here to the first slide, please, Kaylin. So the inspiration for this report was a very clearly emerging picture in California's climate math that we are, in addition to the many things that the state has already excelled in and it's already championing, like efficiency, renewables, clean fuels, clean vehicles. We're going to have to also find ways to capture CO2 from large point sources and also to remove it from the atmosphere. As someone very eloquently put it recently, do your best, remove the rest. CARB's scoping plan from the end of last year very clearly showed that we're expecting a shortfall in actual emission reductions. And in order to be certain that we're going to achieve our carbon neutrality goals by 2045 or earlier, we're going to have to find ways to return CO2 where it came from, back underground. And this is the backdrop. So the state is gearing up to do to execute several rulemakings as a result of recent legislation from last summer. SB 905 mandated a number of these, and we're only flagging a couple here. So the Air Resources Board is tasked with initiating a carbon capture, removal, utilization, and storage program. The California Natural Resources Agency is going to be undertaking a number of rulemakings as well, one of which is going to be looking at unitization and surface and mineral rights compensation for pore space and mineral owners. And we've been getting a ton of questions regarding the value, the fair value for pore space and this compensation. We also are witnessing right now a spurt, if you like, of project development activity, and this is a result of a combination of federal and state incentives in the area of CCS, carbon capture and storage, and CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And we've been contacted by many landowners and local community members who may find themselves in the vicinity of these proposed projects. So this provided the impetus for this report, and we tried to look at how the economics pan out for these projects and what room may be available for local community and landowner benefits, and also to flag particular project types or particular sectors that may still need additional policy support in order to inform the state government's upcoming activities and rulemaking. A quick clarification here, what this report is not. It's not a lookup table. Estimating project cost is a very individualized exercise, and of course we can't look at every single proposed project. Our job was to try and come up with generic estimates and generic numbers, which serve as a useful starting point, but there may be a number of individual factors that make projects either more expensive or cheaper. So each project is its own beast and needs to be looked at individually, but we're doing the best that we can to come up with an informative and useful starting point. And also, this is not an endorsement or opposition of any particular projects. Again, a project is not just the technology or the intent, it's also very much the location, the local context, the execution. So all of these things, including environmental justice, societal impacts, need to be examined on an individual project basis. So this is not an all-out endorsement of projects. It's a generic look at how the economics play out and what could be generically available for local benefits. So we intend to spend about half of today's session on presenting, and then leave the rest for hopefully a useful and lively Q&A session. So next slide, please, Karen. So we're going to start by giving away the punchline, key findings and results. We're then going to examine the cost estimates that we came up with for capture, transport, and storage of CO2. We will then present a number of case studies, 4 case studies, and sensitivities on some of the parameters in order to be able to showcase which are the important things to look at when you're considering the economics of a project. And then we're going to wrap up with conclusions, findings, and implications for policymakers, for community members and landowners, and other stakeholders. So next slide, please. So this is a summary of what we discovered, some of which is not necessarily new, and some of which was a surprise even to us as we embarked on this study. So the first finding is that incentives are essential for project viability. The main reason why we are seeing such a spurt in project development activity today is because of the existence of incentives, and in particular, a combination of incentives. So the federal 45Q tax credit for carbon storage and the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which as of 2018 allowed transportation of fuel sector CCS projects into the mix, have had a very profound effect on project viability. So you get several classes of projects that are economical and have a very meaningful potential for local benefits as a result of the eligibility for those two programs. Projects that cannot combine these two, so that are not eligible for LCFS, but are eligible for 45Q only, face bigger economic challenges, and that is manifested in sectors like the power sector, natural gas combined cycle plants, for example, that we looked at in the report, also cement. These face more challenging and tough economics as a result of not being able to combine two kinds of incentives, but that may be changing, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The main factors that you should be looking at if you're trying to figure out where a project's economics may lie are as follows. There are several secondary ones, but these are the real biggies. First of all, is the concentration of CO2 in the flue gas stream. The more concentrated, the more pure the CO2 is in the flue gas stream, the easier and cheaper the capture of the CO2 is going to be. So sources that emit concentrated high purity sources are going to be easier and cheaper applications. The ability to use CO2 pipelines or marine transport also makes a big difference. Railing and trucking CO2 are possible in a number of ways, and Ben will elaborate on that in a minute. But they do add an economic price tag to the project. They're viable technologically; they're absolutely doable, depending on the distance and the existing infrastructure. They may be economical in particular situations, but in general, they multiply costs in comparison to being able to use a CO2 pipeline. And next slide, please, Kelly. A reiteration here that project specifics play a large role in determining individual project costs. So there are many things that make projects of the same kind very different between them. The plant location plays a big role, the age and configuration of the plant that you are retrofitting with carbon capture, access to low-cost energy. California does have higher than average in the nation energy costs, so being able to access low-cost electricity, for example, may make a meaningful difference to project economics. If you are using a pipeline to transport your CO2, then the routing of that pipeline makes a big difference. It can be straightforward and short, and it may be crossing a small number of ownerships or jurisdictions, or it may be really convoluted, crossing sensitive areas, high population areas, and so on. So things like that can make projects that seem similar on paper actually very different in terms of their economics. And then finally, a set of factors that has emerged strong during COVID, supply chain constraints and inflation can also have a meaningful impact on project costs. That said, this is one of the main and perhaps more surprising findings of this study. We have been used to seeing carbon capture projects as barely able to break even over the past decade and a half or so, as niche applications, as things that will really struggle to make the mainstream. Now, that paradigm is changing, and this is a result of a decade and a half worth of policy action and policy reforms. Now, with the new programs and incentives in place, we're seeing that these projects are no longer niche or marginal, and that some of them are actually approaching mainstream. And we have several classes of project that we'll cover in a minute, which are viable. And some of them leave pretty substantial headroom to direct channel benefits to the host communities and to the landowners involved in those projects. And contrary to popular belief, these are not necessarily cents per ton of CO2 or even single digits. We may be looking at double digits of dollars per ton of CO2. And that is a very new picture that had not emerged until very recently. And it's a combination of the incentives that we now have in place. And then finally, from the broad set of interviews and conversations that we conducted as part of this study, it is our belief and conclusion as institutions that try to serve the public interest, that the broadest possible project acceptance and proliferation would result from a compensation structure to local stakeholders and landowners that grows or shrinks commensurate with actual project revenues. This is something which is very common in the oil and gas sector. So when oil and gas prices go up, the royalties that the mineral owners and the landowners earn also fluctuate up and down. This will be more challenging to implement in the context of CCS because we don't yet have unique or necessarily straightforward or independently published metrics for the size of the revenue that a project developer is earning. Nonetheless, we strongly believe that this is an area well worth focusing on, and we know that the upcoming SB 95 rulemakings may be touching upon this. And I think this is an area where attention and brain power and some thought is required in order to find ways that share those benefits fairly and equitably. Next slide, please. Okay, don't panic. Lots of numbers on the screen and colors, but this is a summary of the case studies that we produced, and this is intended to show that there can be a real range in the cost estimates here, and there are some factors that make a difference if you change, and then some factors that don't make much of a difference. So color coding first. Obviously, there's no unique cost estimate for any particular type of project. We looked at 4 types of projects: ethanol, ethanol capture, and this is an easy application because it's a very high concentration CO2 stream. 2 kinds of refinery applications, and this could be petroleum or they could be biofuel refineries, and in particular the fluid catalytic crackers and the steam methane reformers, the hydrogen plants, both of which produce a fairly concentrated CO2 stream. And then finally, we looked at natural gas combined cycle plants and cement production facilities. So each of these has a range of costs. The literature is, I wouldn't say all over the map, but it does present a fairly wide range in some cases. So green means it's at the low end of this estimated and published cost range. Red means it's at the high end of the capture cost range. So the top half of the table here shows the end calculation. So we netted out incentives and revenues from expenditures. Ben will tell you more about the cash flow calculation that we performed. And this is showing you the punchline. So the end result of whether we expect a project to be in the pluses and be a profit-making project, or to be in the red and actually be a deficit and therefore not be viable. So on the left, you have surpluses, and you'll see that for ethanol, the surplus could be between $93 and $114 per ton. For refinery applications, the spread is broader. So for fluid catalytic crackers, it could be from $33 per ton of surplus to $87. For refinery steam methane reformers, hydrogen production, the range is between 17 and 90. And all of these are eligible for both 45Q and LCFS, hence the surplus. When we move to natural gas combined cycle plants and cement, the picture that emerges is tougher. They both seem to be in the negative. So they present a net project deficit. For an NGCC, this could be between minus 27 and minus 104 dollars per ton of CO2. For cement, it could be even larger. Keep in mind that the cement case study that we looked at assumed rail transport. So those numbers that you're seeing here for cement we would be showing a lower deficit if we were using a pipeline for transportation. The bottom half of the picture shows our sensitivity. So we try to tweak some parameters in order to showcase what might make a difference to project economics. So in the case of ethanol, we said, let's use a pipeline instead of barge. So our base case assumption was that barge transport was moving CO2 from the ethanol plant. What we see there is that because this particular case was a short distance, pipeline costs actually increased the project surplus from $93 to $106 per ton of CO2. And the red font means that we assume the high end, i.e. we were conservative in our capture cost assumptions. We ran a number of refinery sensitivities. Number one here says, okay, what if we use a tanker trucks instead of a pipeline to move the CO2? And what you see that's from a surplus of $17 a ton, we move to a deficit of minus $45 a ton. So tanker trucks do have an economic burden to the project. For the refinery number two sensitivity, we assumed the low end of the capture costs, and we said, okay, let's use barges instead of the pipeline if we assume that pipeline is not feasible. There is a minor hit to the project cost, but nonetheless, we're still running a healthy surplus here. So instead of $90 per ton, we move to $76. Increasing the incentive period for 45Q tax credits to 20 years instead of the currently specified by statute 12 years didn't really make a big difference. So you earn the credits for a longer period. The project will run for a longer period. It will run for 20 years instead of 12 years. And you move your surplus from $17 to $24 a ton for this refinery application. So essentially you're spreading your capital expenditure over a larger number of years, but really the bottom line is very similar. So simply extending the incentive period doesn't make a big difference. What does make a big difference is if we change the LCFS credit price. So our base case assumption, we try to be conservative. We think it was $125 per ton LCFS credit price. So we move that to 175, which is well within what we've seen over the past few years at the high end. And given the Air Resources Board's upcoming rulemaking to revise the program, we think that it's going to be fairly readily achievable. So moving it from 125 to 175 credit price, we're seeing a substantial increase in project surplus from $17 to $57 per ton. Final sensitivity on refineries, we try to increase the rate of return to 15% from 8%. And that did have an impact. It transformed a $17 per ton surplus to a minus 23 deficit. So depending on how you're structured for your projects in terms of financing and what rate of return you need to achieve in order to become economical, this may have an impact. So depending on your market capitalization, size of your enterprise, vertical integration, and so on, your desired rate of return may change. And essentially, the smaller you are and less powerful you are, then the higher rate you're aiming for. Finally, power plants. We increased the incentive period to 20 years. Again, not a big difference. It decreases the deficit slightly from -104 to -97. And cement, big change here. If we can use a pipeline instead of rail, it transforms a deficit of -$224 per ton to a -84. So big difference here. Punchline, the ability to site and operate CO2 pipelines makes a big difference in project economics. Okay, enough numbers. This is a quick recap of revenue sources, and I'll turn over to Ben in a second here to talk about cost estimates. There are two main sources here that were applicable to the classes of project that we looked at. There's the federal 45Q tax credit, a little bit more detail since we mentioned it. This has been revised statutorily, I think, 3 times. The latest revision was during the Inflation Reduction Act, a little over a year ago. The value of the credit ranges between $50 and $85 per ton for saline storage of industrial CO2, and it could be as high as $180 a ton for direct air capture. You get the credit for 12 years. It's inflation adjusted. You need to commence construction before January 1st, 2033. And as a result of recent reforms, the credit is transferable, and there's also a direct payment option. So the Congress tried to make the credit more usable, more flexible by implementing those changes. Low carbon fuel standards. Many of you are the resident experts in the state on this program, but a very quick summary here for those of you who are less familiar with it. The program started over a decade ago to decrease the carbon intensity of California's transportation fuels. The LCFS credit prices vary. They are traded in a market, and we've seen them very approximately between the $60 and $200 per ton range in the past few years. They've dropped a little bit below 60, and they've gone a little bit above 200. So market developments, project implementation, new technologies affect these credit prices, as does the setting of the LCFS targets, which is about to be revised by CARB. And we expect, and CARB expects, and that's outlined in recent workshop presentation, that there will be an upward trend in the coming years as a result of anticipated tightening of LCFS targets, which is a direct outflow of the conclusions from the scoping plan, that the program needs to become more ambitious, as do several other climate mitigation efforts in the state. The prerequisite for earning LCFS credits, if you're implementing CCS, is that you have to comply with a protocol that the Air Resources Board adopted in 2018, and this is a very long list that tries to safeguard project integrity, accountability, and accounting. So over to Ben to take us through some of the cost estimates for the various stages in the CCS chain.
Thanks, George. So as George mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of the cost inputs used for this study, and also take a closer look at the case studies that we applied these costs to. So to give an overview, CCS projects have 3 main components in their value chain. That's capture, transportation, and storage. The cost of capture is usually the largest cost in the CCS project value chain. That might not be the case when you use some forms of transportation. They're very costly, but generally it is the most costly piece. So for our study, we derived capture cost estimates from published literature in industry surveys for a range of relevant sectors that George has mentioned. This includes cement plants, refineries, natural gas power plants, and ethanol plants. And these cost ranges are based on amine absorption technology. And we chose this technology as it currently is the most commercially available and mature capture technology. So capture costs vary pretty significantly across different sectors, with costs being generally higher for more dilute CO2 streams like natural gas power plants, and generally lower for more highly concentrated streams of CO2, like that from the fermenter of an ethanol plant. We applied cost ranges for capture rather than a single number for each sector, because there can be significant variability in actual costs to capture from an individual unique plant. And so our cost estimates from published literature generally overlap with estimates from our industry survey at the higher end. And this is likely due to things like recent inflation, supply chain issues, things that aren't really captured in the literature, but that have been affecting the industry in the recent few years. I'll also note that these costs are representative, particularly at the higher ends of first mover projects. And we really expect that the cost of capture will decline over time as CCS projects are deployed more widely and alternative capture technologies are commercialized and deployed. So Kaylin, you can go to the next slide. So for transportation costs, we considered 4 different types of transportation for the study, all of which have quite a wide range of costs associated with them. We'll start with pipeline. Pipeline cost estimates for our study were generated using NETL's transportation cost model. And our results show that pipeline is by far the most economically favorable mode of transportation, which I'm sure doesn't really come as a surprise. For reference, a generic 60-mile pipeline, and when I say generic 60-mile pipeline, we're not looking at a specific route. There are a lot of other things that go into planning pipelines that could accrue additional cost. But for our generic case study, the 60-mile pipeline transporting around 1 million tons of CO2 per year has a CapEx of about $1 million per mile and an operating cost of around $1 per ton. So we also considered rail. And rail cost estimates used in this study are based on a recent analysis by Lawrence Livermore researchers. And rail transportation is often considered where there are no other options that really exist. And it could be a feasible mode of transportation, but as George mentioned earlier, this comes at a significant cost. For reference, rail transportation costs in our study start slightly above $100 per ton, which is very significant. Rail does, however, show really only modest cost increases with distance. So this mode of transportation makes sense for larger transportation distances, not really for shorter, think under 100 miles. So we can go to the next slide and wrap up transportation. So similar to rail, and we looked at trucking, and trucking cost estimates are based on, again, a recent analysis by Lawrence Livermore Lab researchers. And truck transportation can be feasible over shorter distances, so less than 100 miles, using intermodals. And just a quick note on that, intermodals they're large standardized containers. They can be loaded and transported by a variety of different means, including truck, rail, and even ship. And usually intermodals lower the transportation costs by avoiding things like repackaging and offloading cargo. And so the cost of intermodal truck transportation from our study starts around $50 per ton for distances under 100 miles. And finally, that leaves barge transportation, which we also considered. And due to the lack of published literature on barge transportation at this point, cost estimates for barge are based solely from industry surveys of market participants for this study. We find that barge transport can be feasible and cost-effective for projects that have access to suitable waterways. So barge transportation CapEx is around $25 million for each barge itself, with an additional $5 to $7 per ton in OpEx, depending on the degree of which each of those barges is utilized. And so in sum, for transportation, we expect barging where available to be more economical than trucking or railing, but pipeline transport is always going to be more economically favorable to barging. Given the complexity and lead times involved with siting pipelines, though, barging could still serve as a valuable option for certain locales. So next, you can move on to the next slide, please. And we'll move on to storage costs. So the final piece of the value chain of CCS projects is geologic storage. And for our study, geologic storage cost estimates were generated using NETL's saline storage cost model. Geologic storage costs cover really the whole lifetime of a project, from site characterization, drilling and completing wells, through injection operations and monitoring, and even post-injection site care and closure. So for our study, we use geologic inputs gathered from published WestCarb data and reports for 3 generic and indicative storage locations. In reality, there's a lot of great storage in California, but we wanted to focus on 3 distinct storage locations to help bound our sensitivities on transportation relative distances. And so that included storage near Stockton in the southern Sacramento Basin, storage near Modesto in the northern San Joaquin Basin, and storage in Kern County in the southern San Joaquin Basin. So for a typical project injecting about 1 million tons per year over 12 years, which again is the length of the 45Q tax credit, and that's how we've modeled our case studies, using 3 injection wells, total CapEx is coming out at just under $100 million with OpEx around $8 per ton. And so if you consider DOE estimates of storage costs, we're typically, for most of the US, between about $7 to $13 per ton. Our modeled storage costs come in a bit higher than that. But this is mostly due to our model only operating for 12 years, which is really less than a typical commercial project would operate and where a lot of published estimates of storage costs would be. So this means that CapEx from storage is spread across fewer total tons, and the cost per ton is subsequently higher. I also just wanted to quickly note that the storage costs in the study include acquisition of 3D seismic for site characterization and for monitoring the injected CO2 plume. This really constitutes a significant portion of total storage cost, can be anywhere from 20 to 30% of the total cost of storage. And so with that, we can move on to the case studies. So let's turn to the meat of the study. We're going to apply these cost estimates to actual case studies. And so we applied the costs to 4 indicative case studies around California, and they span multiple different sectors and unique logistics, sensitivities, really to demonstrate the effect of these various factors on project costs and economics, as George had mentioned previously. So to get a better sense of project economics, we also applied a simple and conservative cash flow calculation to each case study. And I'd like to just quickly go over some of the basic assumptions we made for this. We assume a capital outlay over the first 3 years of the project, with revenues then accruing thereafter. As I mentioned before, the 45Q tax credit window is 12 years, so we keep the operations of these model projects at 12 years. LCFS credit price of $125 per ton. Our base case, we assume a target rate of return of 8%. And also, we subtract 8% of issued LCFS credits, assuming to account for what needs to be paid into an LCFS, a buffer account. And so we can move on to the next slide and get into the first case study. So first, we looked at capture from corn ethanol plant near Stockton. And so this is just a nameplate facility that we modeled, not a particular existing plant. But the significance here is ethanol is really low-hanging fruit for CCS. There's an incredibly high purity stream, CO2, capture costs are really low. It's relatively simple to retrofit for the purpose of carbon capture. And ethanol qualifies for both LCFS and 45Q. So we assume 500,000 tons per year of capture and geologic storage near the Delta region, which is about 10 miles by barge for this scenario. And so, as George mentioned before, even using high and low end costs, the project surpluses are pretty significant for ethanol, which we would generally expect. For the $114 high end surplus, that's assuming the lowest end of the cost ranges, and the $93 per ton surplus, assuming the higher end of cost ranges. The sensitivity using a dedicated 10-mile pipeline instead of barge yielded fairly small savings with the surplus of about $106 per ton. So in sum, ethanol is ready to rock right now. The economics pencil out very well for it. And they really have, even before 45Q is amended to $85 when you can stack with LCFS. So you can move on to the next slide, please. So next, our second case study, we looked at capture from 2 components of a refinery, a hypothetical refinery in the Bay Area, and that's capturing from a steam methane reformer and from a fluid catalytic cracker. The significance here is there's a decent cluster, high density cluster of refineries in the Bay Area, and these are major sources of CO2 that need to be abated. They also these particular components of the refineries emit relatively high concentrations of CO2, so we think these are pretty prime targets for CCS. So we assume 1 million tons per year of capture from each the SMR and the FCCs. We assume geologic storage is occurring in the Delta region again, but this time 60 miles pipeline distance. And again, similar to ethanol, these projects would be eligible for both LCFS and 45Q. And so the results of this case study really show that high concentration refinery components like FCCs and SMRs present economically favorable targets for CCS. And that's largely due to being able to stack the credits. At the lower end of the capture cost ranges and using pipeline transport, there are healthy surpluses that are really up to $90 per ton of CO2. At the high end of the cost range and using pipeline, again, this shrinks to $17 per ton, which is still comfortably economical. And so these are the two cases that really show, as we had mentioned before, very favorable economics, and did come as a bit of a surprise, but being able to stack the 45Q and LCFS tax credit means a lot. So we'll go on to the next case study, if you mind advancing the slide. And this is capture from natural gas combined cycle power plant. And we assume this to be in Tracy. And so this is a scenario where this project's only going to be eligible for 45Q tax credit, not LCFS. So the economics look significantly different. The significance of this is that power plants are common, natural gas power plants are common in California, even under high renewable grid. Some plants are really still going to need to be around for dispatchable and baseload power, so we need to decarbonize them. And so we assume, again, 100 million tons per year. We assume storage near Modesto, so this is about a 35-mile pipeline. And the results really show that, of this case study, show that CCS on NGCCs are still going to face challenging economics, as they currently only qualify for 45Q tax credit incentive. On the lower end of costs, the projects may be within reach if a plant is in close proximity to good storage. And also, I just wanted to mention that NGCCs are subject to California's cap and trade program, and recognition of CCS under that program really could help to tilt the economics of CCS on NGCCs in favor of project development. And so we consider this to, the viability of these particular projects to depend on future policy developments, but generally within reach. And if we go to the next slide, this will be our final case study. We looked at capture on a cement plant in the Mojave area. And the significance here, California is one of the largest U.S. cement producers. There's 7 operational plants in the state emitting over 10 million tons of CO2 per year. This needs to be abated, and CCS is, at this point, one of the few means to actually reduce emissions from cement plants, because there are process emissions involved in creating cement. You can't just simply electrify them and abate those emissions. So similarly to the other case studies, we're assuming 1 million tons per year. We assume geologic storage in Kern County, and this is 60 miles distance by rail, which incurs a significant cost. And again, cement is only eligible for 45Q. And so the results of this case study show that, both the low and high end cost ranges for cement with rail face challenging economics. Although rail is technically and logistically feasible, it places significant strain on the project economics, and utilizing pipeline transport could reduce the high end deficit pretty significantly. And this further demonstrates the utility of pipelines in these projects. And similarly to NGCCs, the economic viability of cement is really likely going to depend on future policy developments that affect this sector, as cement is also only eligible for one type of incentive, and that's 45Q. It's worth noting, though, that under recent legislation, as George mentioned before, CARB has set out to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy for California's cement sector to achieve net zero emissions. And this means that additional incentives for carbon capture on cement may be available in the future. Additionally, we consider amine absorption technology in this study, as I mentioned before, but there are other emerging capture technologies, particularly for cement, that may be less costly and could improve the economics on cement, CCS on cement. So overall, challenging economics, but within reach. And with that, I'll turn it back over to George to wrap up our slides here.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Cement does have other options, and one of our attendees today, Bob Epstein, under Project 2030, wrote a recent report on this, which I urge you to look at. It's linked in our report. Okay, so enough geeking out on numbers here. Let's wrap up and turn it over to your questions. A quick recap of key findings here, and then we'll turn on to a final slide on implications. Incentives are essential for viability, project viability. Combining them is what really makes some projects today economical. Projects that do not qualify under the low carbon fuel standard face challenging economics. When you're trying to gauge whether a project is economically strong or marginal, you should be looking at the concentration of CO2 in the flue gas stream. The higher, the better. If you can use pipelines or barge transport, that can keep your costs much lower. Proximity to a good storage site is a big plus. Trucking and railing of CO2 are definitely viable technologically, and given the right circumstances, they may even be viable economically for a project, but they do come with an additional burden, economic burden. Next slide, please. Please look at project specifics. These can have a profound effect on project costs. So don't go around saying CATF told me or Lawrence Livermore told me that this project costs X. This report is not a lookup table. If you want to get a good handle of project economics, then you really do need to look at project specifics. Conversely, I think it's incumbent on developers to be able to communicate and share some of these specifics that affect their economics to the local stakeholder community. Good news, several classes of projects are viable today, and they may have up to double-digit dollars per ton of CO2 surpluses that can be used for local causes and benefits. And we believe that the proliferation of this family of technologies in the state is going to depend heavily on finding ways to make these work for everybody. They need to work for the climate, they need to work for the developer, and they also need to work for the host community. So let's move to the final slide here on implications. First set of implications for policymakers, and we have quite a few of you with us today. Thank you. Incentive programs do work. You know this, of course, but the results of this study also underline it. California has a long track record of kickstarting, supporting, proliferating technologies through its incentive programs and policies. And these have been very successful in many cases. The coverage and eligibility of CCS and CDR incentives is currently not as broad as it needs to be if we're going to be in line with 2045 carbon neutrality goals. I think this was also evident in the scoping plan revision. LCFS makes a big difference, but it only applies to transportation fuel sector projects. So these successes of these programs need to be replicated more broadly, either through existing programs or through upcoming programs under SB 905, SB 596, or other legislation. Implications for developers. I think this is a good time to be a developer. Many of the pieces that have been traditionally lacking in the sector are finally falling into place. We have moved away from a life support kind of existence to a period of, I think, opportunity. CCS and CDR projects are moving away from their former niche nature towards the mainstream. Of course, the first batch of projects is always more challenging, but in terms of policy reform, we've seen many meaningful moves in the past few years. We would encourage to find new ways to share project benefits equitably, that will pave the way for greater project proliferation. And then finally, implications for landowners, for community members and local stakeholders. We firmly believe that CCS and CDR projects can coexist with existing activities. We know that farmers are under a lot of pressure because of drought and because of reforms in how the state manages its water and groundwater in particular. And geologic storage of CO2 can provide a new revenue stream that could support or even revitalize farming communities and farmland without being in conflict with farming. The surface footprint for CO2 storage is very small, and it can harmoniously coexist with existing activities. And then finally, in the course of pore space value discussions or leases, project details do matter. CCS projects are not easy to put together. They entail a very high degree of complexity, many moving parts. Nonetheless, as of recently, we think that they can be economically viable. So please be sensitive to some of the challenges that developers may be facing. At the same time, lease structures do matter, and our numbers show that this could be a very beneficial revenue stream for local stakeholders, local communities, local landowners. And we think that leases should be structured in a way that channel these benefits equitably. So that's the end from us. Open to your questions.
Thank you, Ben and George. We're now going to transition to the Q&A section. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A function. Sally or Susan, would you like to take the first question?
Sure. We have several technical questions that we'll start off with. One is going back to your chart on the values that you shared, George, and whether or not they were real or nominal dollars.
All tons are metric in this report. All dollars are real 2022 figures.
Second question, are there existing pipelines that can be reused for this purpose, or would new pipelines need to be installed in each instance?
I'll take that, Ben, if that's okay. So my understanding is that the bulk of the pipelines that we're looking at will be new constructions. The specs for CO2 pipelines are stricter. They need to be built to a higher standard in order to transport CO2 in a dense phase, which is more economical. If you're only going to go short distances, and by shorts, I mean a small number of miles, maybe double digits, then you can transport CO2 in the gaseous phase. That's my understanding, but it's less efficient. Now, in those cases, because of the lower pressures, you could repurpose an existing pipeline. You would have to pay attention to the integrity of the existing pipe. So for the most part, I think what we're looking at is the construction of new dedicated CO2 pipelines that are going to be transporting it in a dense phase. But in some more select cases, you may be able to repurpose an existing one. Ben, any corrections, objections?
Nope, that was great.
Next question, this analysis considers individual projects. Do you think the economics could improve overall if capture and storage were deployed in a hub configuration with a networked and shared CO2 transport system?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one. Yes, absolutely. We considered individual projects for this to show, first movers developing projects that are likely going to be moving forward quickly. But as projects are deployed, and we ultimately want to see coordination between different projects, you're going to be able to reach significant economies of scale with a hub-like approach, being able to share infrastructure for transportation and both storage. You're cutting down, significant costs with shared infrastructure. It requires additional planning, oversizing of infrastructure, but absolutely the economics would improve with a combined approach or a hub-like approach versus what we have modeled here, which is just single projects. George, if you want to add anything else, please do.
No, that's no pun intended, perfectly captured, man.
Next question regarding community benefit engagements. What are you thinking of when you recommend, quote, new ways to share project benefits equitably?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We do not pretend to be community benefit package experts here. We wanted to put some bounds on the magnitude of what may be on the table. I think it's someone else's job who's more skilled, more qualified, more familiar to opine on this. That said, well, what we're getting at when we say share more equitably is the following. As I said, when you have an oil and gas lease, if the oil price goes up, so does the revenue stream for the mineral and land, mineral rights owner and landowner. Our understanding from conversations with landowners and with project developers is the current leases that are on offer a fixed nature of compensation, which is indexed to the volume of CO2. So the more CO2 you put down there, the more you get paid, but it's a fixed price per ton. On the other hand, what we have on the revenue side and the incentive side is that there is a fixed tax credit, the federal one, but the LCFS credit price, which is now on the low end of the spectrum, could climb significantly. And we saw in some of the sensitivities that can have a profound effect on project economics. So if LCFS credit prices climb, then the communities and the landowners never see any of that benefit, because a fixed dollar per ton lease won't channel any of that. So what we mean by more equitable sharing of these benefits is coming up with new ways, new indices, new metrics, whereby if things go well, the local community and the local landowner can also receive a portion of that upside. If things go badly, then the flow shrinks. But if that float is fixed or pinned to a particular number, then the upside is not shared equitably, it's shared only by the developer.
Next question is broader in nature than the report. I would like to hear about the relative merits of CO2 sequestration versus biochar, including its simple burial as an alternative or supplementary storage means.
I'm happy to just quickly talk. I'm not a biochar expert, but just happy to talk about the relative permanence and durability of these two solutions and how this all fits into the same system. But carbon storage, geologic carbon storage, is really seen as the most durable solution that we have for locking away CO2 on geologic timescales. So we can consider this a permanent, more or less permanent means of trapping away emissions. This is on the order of tens of thousands, if not millions of years. Whereas other solutions like biochar, for instance, I don't know off the top of my head what the relative, and George, you may know, what the relative life cycle of biochar and this carbon that's trapped away in it is, but it's generally on a shorter time frame than geologic storage. So what does that actually mean? I mean, we certainly need to prioritize durable solutions that are going to be permanent to fight to curb our emissions and put carbon back where it came from. But that's not to say that additional solutions like biochar, like reforestation and other things aren't still important. This kind of is underpinned by the need for optionality. I don't think it should be necessarily a pull between one or the other, but really we need it all. But the relative merits really boil down to permanence. And George, please fill in if you have anything else you'd want to add.
No, I completely agree, Ben. You know, there's a reason why you go to the trouble to study geology, drill wells that go thousands of feet deep in order to return the fossil carbon where it came from to begin with. And that is safety, security of storage, and permanence. I'm also not a biochar expert, but from the little knowledge that I have, I think the jury is still out and the scientists are still debating durability and residence timeframes. One thing I would also add is that biochar can be used in different ways and combined with geologic storage. So if, for example, you use the biochar in a cement kiln to replace coal use, and then you capture using engineered means, like we've talked about, the carbon from that facility, then you're also sending the biochar carbon thousands of feet underground. So there are other alternative uses for biochar that could be used to lower the carbon intensity of industrial processes.
One final question for both of you. You mentioned the implications, the findings of the studies, but what was the biggest surprise that came from the study for each of you?
Ben, you go.
Yeah, I've been working in this space for quite some time before many of these incentives were at the level they are at right now. And I think, and I assume George is thinking the same thing. The biggest surprise to me is just how viable some projects are right now with the ability to stack 45Q and LCFS credits, or at just such a different place for this, for the market of CCS than we were even a few years ago, particularly with 45Q tax credit being amended to $85. So I just thought it was really great to be able to see that, we can demonstrate there are project classes right now that not only are not just marginally economic, but comfortably economical.
And these are my sentiments exactly. I've been in this field now for 15 years and have become unfortunately accustomed to, being the neglected child, even though we need this in the climate portfolio. The pleasant surprise from all this is that these technologies are really coming of age, and we're far from declaring success. We need pilot projects urgently in order to be on the right track. But all of a sudden, the economics for these seem to pan out, and that is a result of policy reforms. So I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to seeing carbon leave the atmosphere and go back on the ground.
Those are our questions.
So, thank you. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to thank everyone who joined today, and to those who asked questions, and to Ben and George. We hope you found the results of the study insightful or helpful. Again, please reach out to me if you'd like the recording, and to those who have already emailed me, I've seen them come in. I hope to have the recording ready for you guys later today. Thank you again, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.